Hi, it's Joe, and what you're about to hear is a sample of an episode from a new podcast created. Now, if you like it, it vibes with what you're looking for in a true crime podcast, go over and subscribe to the new one. You can find links for it in the episode notes here, or you can just search for True Crime Blueprint. I'll be releasing weekly episodes there, full deep dives, no 10-minute restriction. So again, if you like this new podcast, it's very important that you search for and go to True Crime Blueprint and follow, subscribe to the new podcast. A 6-year-old girl goes missing from her bedroom on the morning after Christmas. 3 hours later, her father finds her body in the basement of their own house. One of the most prominent families in their city becomes the most hated family in America. And 29 years later, nobody has gone to prison for it. This is True Crime Blueprint. Okay, so let me set the scene here, because to really understand this case, you have to understand who the Ramseys were before any of this happened. And I think part of the story gets completely lost because people jump straight to the pageant photos and the suspicion and the press conferences. There's a whole life that existed before December 26th, 1996, and it matters enormously. John Ramsey was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in December of 1943. He grew up in the Midwest with a very structured, achievement-oriented value system that a lot of people from that part of the country carry with them their whole lives. He eventually moved to Michigan, attended Michigan State, got his bachelor's degree, then his MBA. He served in the Navy after that. His military experience instilled a particular sense of order and hierarchy in him that would later define his management style as a CEO, and it would later be misread by investigators and the public as emotional coldness. His first marriage was to a woman named Lucinda. They married in 1966, and they had 3 children together, Elizabeth, Melinda, and John Andrew. That marriage ended in 1978. And here's something that gets genuinely underappreciated in most profiles of John Ramsey. In January of 1992, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was killed in a car accident at the age of 22 in Athens, Georgia. John Ramsey had already lost a child before JonBenét. He already knew what it felt like to have his world collapse without warning. That piece of his psychological history is real and important because when investigators later described him as seeming too composed after JonBenét's death, they were evaluating a man who had already been through devastating grief once before. That's not an excuse for anything. It's just context that deserves to be part of the picture. Now, enter Patsy. Patricia Ann Paul was born 1956 in Parkersburg, West Virginia. She grew up in a household where ambition was encouraged and achievement was the clear expectation. Her mother fostered her participation in beauty pageants from a young age, and Patsy absorbed that mentality completely. In 1977, she won Miss West Virginia. And here's a detail that really tells you who Patsy Ramsey was at her core. She reportedly watched the previous year's competition and took detailed notes before entering herself. She studied it. She reverse engineered what winning looked like, and then she went out and she won the thing herself. That meticulous, analytical approach to achievement would later define how she operated as a pageant mother to JonBenét. She got a journalism degree from West Virginia University, moved to Atlanta, and in that city's social orbit, she met John Ramsey, who was by then a successful businessman turning a garage-based startup into something significant. They married in 1980. Patsy was 13 years younger than John. John's company, called Access Graphics, was eventually acquired by Lockheed Martin and grew into a subsidiary that reached $1 billion in annual sales. John mentioned that milestone proudly in the family's 1996 Christmas card, because that's exactly what a CEO running $1 billion company in 1996 would do. That's peak 90s executive culture right there. Merry Christmas. Here are the photos of the kids. Also, BT Dubs, I run a multi-billion-dollar company. God bless. Now, those aren't exactly the words that he used, but I'm taking a liberty there. The family moved to Boulder, Colorado in 1991, following John's professional success. They settled into a 7,000 square foot Tudor-style home. They were prominent members of St. John's Episcopal Church. They hosted elaborate parties and were visible at the top of Boulder's social circle. By every surface measurement, they were living exactly that life that the American professional culture told them that they were supposed to build. There was, however, something heavy underneath all of that carefully constructed success. In 1993, Patsy was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Stage 4, that's not a diagnosis that you strategize around. That's a diagnosis that fundamentally reorders a person's relationship with time, with their children, with the very concept of the future. She went through aggressive chemotherapy. She went into remission, and surviving something that was expected to probably kill you leaves its own psychological residue. It can intensify your focus on legacy, on appearance, on the things you can control when your body has proven itself to be unreliable. A lot of people who have analyzed Patsy Ramsey's behavior later, especially her intense involvement in JonBenét's pageant career, have pointed to that cancer diagnosis as a turning point and how she processed the concept of time and what mattered most in the time that she had. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990 in Atlanta, Georgia. By the time the family settled in Boulder, she was a toddler, and she grew up in a city that was, culturally speaking, pretty far removed from the pageant world her mother came from. Boulder, in the mid-1990s, had a very specific personality. It was academic, outdoorsy, liberal, and fairly low-key about overt displays of wealth. The richest person at any given Boulder social event was probably wearing a fleece vest and talking about a hiking trail they'd recently discovered. Status existed, but it tended to express itself through experiences and ideas rather than formal appearance. That was the environment JonBenét grew up in. And then there were the Ramseys, with their Southern-influenced traditions, their formal, entertaining style, and their participation in a pageant subculture that was well established in Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee, but landed somewhat oddly in Boulder. JonBenét competed in child beauty pageants. She held titles including Little Miss Colorado and National Tiny Miss Beauty. Patsy coached her, dressed her in elaborate costumes, arranged her hair and stage makeup. In the pageant community, there was standard practice. In the context of Boulder, it felt foreign and a little uncomfortable to a lot of people who encountered it. And here's where I want to be careful, because there's a significant amount of judgment that gets loaded onto the Ramseys based entirely on those pageant photos. Was child pageantry the right choice? People genuinely disagree on that, and it's a legitimate conversation. Was it evidence of abuse or neglect? The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. JonBenét, by the accounts of people that actually knew her in daily life, was a cheerful, energetic, funny kid. She liked to dance. She liked to perform. Whether that enthusiasm was entirely her own or partly shaped by her mother's ambitions is something we can't definitively separate. But treating her parents' participation in pageant culture as proof of deeper dysfunction or violent secrets is a logical leap that the facts simply do not support. What is true is that the images from those pageants, a 6-year-old in heavy makeup and sequined costumes styled to look much older, became the defining visual shorthand for this entire case in the media. And those images shaped the national conversation in ways that had almost nothing to do with justice and almost everything to do with American cultural discomfort with a very specific kind of parenting. You have to understand the environment this happened in to fully understand how the public and the police responded to it. By 1996, violent crime in the U.S. had been falling for several years, running. Boulder specifically was doing well on every single metric. Serious crimes on the University of Colorado campus were down nearly 20% that year. Burglary rates were dropping citywide. People in Boulder felt genuinely, reasonably safe. There's a particular confidence that comes with a low crime rate combined with a university town's sense of its own thoughtfulness. Boulder had that. Nobody in that community was operating with their guard fully up, because statistically they didn't need to be. This matters because it explains some of what happened with the initial police response. The Boulder Police Department, in 1996, had years of experience handling drug offenses, property crimes, and the occasional assault. They had no meaningful experience handling anything like what landed on their desks on December 26, and that inexperience would cost the investigation dearly within the first few hours. The Ramseys spent Christmas Day, 1996, making the social rounds. They visited friends, including the family of Fleet White, who would become a significant figure later in the story. They got home late. JonBenét had apparently fallen asleep in the car on the way home, and John... All right, what'd you think? It's a bit different than regular 10-minute murder episodes. I didn't want to create a new podcast that was simply a 10-minute murder, but longer. So this one's still me and my vibe. Actually, it's probably much more me because I'm not limited by time constraints. So please, right now, go and follow True Crime Blueprint wherever you're listening to this episode. That's super important for the show to grow like 10-minute murder has grown. Hey, Joe, question. Will you still be doing 10-minute murder? Answer. Absolutely, I will. 10-minute murder has been and always will be the main podcast for me into the foreseeable future. So I'm not slowing down, or that podcast isn't going to go anywhere. So don't worry about that. Thank you for listening to both podcasts. Now, go and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.